So, I was looking back at last year's conference and realised it's almost a year to the day since I addressed this same conference in a paper that began by asking you to consider the scenarios for the outcome of the 2016 election. These scenarios are worth revisiting as we contemplate the year ahead, if for no other reason that they show us what has changed in a tumultuous year, but also what has stayed the same, and they remind us of the underlying forces shaping politics in 2017. It's sometimes hard to remember that we are only 8 months into the term of the current Parliament. Yet, despite the fact the government has actually been able to get the Senate to work more effectively than occurred in the last Parliament, we see the new cycle dominated by opinion polls extraordinarily early in the electoral cycle, and almost constant speculation about the longevity of the Prime Minister. This is despite the fact that there is no politically marketable alternative candidate for the job within the coalition. Sorry about that, Peter Dutton. This is the ongoing result and the price we pay for the night those Labor smarty pants got rid of Kevin Rudd in 2010. It's hard to overemphasise how much that decision has reoriented the way politicians think in Canberra to this day. When things aren't going well now, you top the leader. You don't actually try to think through a strategy that, between now and election day, might still see you win through. Think about the day-to-day implications of that. Within the political bubble, there is little incentive to perceive yourself as part of a team. There is every reason to be not just considering leadership options, but what each individual may gain in terms of new jobs if there is a change of personnel. You are thinking about the next job, not the current one. If you're not thinking about developing an overall strategy to take to the next election, you're thinking about ways to differentiate yourself on policy from your colleagues, rather than thinking about policies that reflect the concerns of voters. Of course, Malcolm Turnbull's vulnerability, not just to an actual leadership challenge, but to the constant carping which distracts everyone from the job at hand of governing the country, goes back to those election results we were considering this time last year. Yes, his standing with voters in current times might not be very good, but it was the narrowness of the government's election win last year that let the deplorables off the leash and meant lots of coalition MPs began their new terms nervous about their prospects. In other words, it created the base from which all things have flowed. So let's go back to the scenarios from March last year. Keep in mind that we didn't know at that time that Malcolm Turnbull would definitely call a July double dissolution election. In fact, the question of how he could actually manipulate one was still being hotly debated. The various scenarios I laid out for you, however, were all based on the presumption that there would be a double D. The scenarios included Malcolm Turnbull winning a thumping majority in a workable Senate, 2 scenarios which proved very close to what actually happened, and 2 in which Labor was able to either form minority government or win in its own right. The 2 scenarios that proved closest to the actual outcome involved the coalition either losing 10 seats, a bare majority of 4, or losing 15 seats, but having the prospect of forming minority government with independents in the House of Representatives. In the end, of course, the coalition lost 14 seats and just barely holds to a majority with 76 seats in the 150-seat Parliament. At the time, I think the scenarios were very sobering. In fact, I remember them being quite shocking to a lot of the people in the room, because then, as now, in all the conversations that we have about politics and the quality of governance, we often don't actually confront the brutal realities of what might await us down the track. The polls at the time of last year's CEDA conference were suggesting a 3.5% swing against the coalition, which pointed to it winning just 74 seats in its own right, so just slightly less than it did in reality, and in fact only in a position to form a minority government. Yet, even with the narrowing polls, both sides of politics operating at that time were doing so on the implicit presumption that whatever happened, the coalition would win the election. This presumption was so firmly entrenched that it affected the way both sides of politics behaved. For example, the expectation that Bill Shorten would lead Labor to a loss affected the way the internal dynamics of his party operated. On the coalition side of politics, the presumption was clearly that the government would be returned, no matter what. Or we presume that is the case because the alternative explanation for why so many MPs believed ill discipline could reign is deeply troubling. Now, here is one of those sobering then and now moments about how little has changed since this time last year. Exactly a year ago this week, I was reflecting on how members of the Liberal Party, both those in Parliament and lay members, were expressing their anger and horror at the damage Tony Abbott was doing at the time. Abbott himself was forced to come out the week of the conference and say that of course he supported the return of a Turnbull government. Spooky, huh? It's easy to forget the trouble was going on before the election campaign, just as it has ever since. The point I'm making here, though, is not about Tony Abbott in particular, though in truth his party would really benefit now if he would just go away, but about the endemic nature of this dynamic where people can keep the stability of government on a permanent knife edge. By this time last year, Malcolm Turnbull had already lost a lot of that surge of goodwill that accompanied him to the Prime Ministership. As he continues to do now, Turnbull leads Bill Shorten as preferred Prime Minister, though obviously his standing has continued to sag. Despite all the carping and electoral animosity, I still find it interesting that, until very recently, Turnbull's personal ratings were still stronger than his party's, just as it is equally intriguing that Bill Shorten's are weaker than Labor's. This is despite the fact that whether you agree with either man, Shorten is the smarter political operator. Bill Shorten was perhaps the only person who thought he could win last year's election, and he led an opposition that, feeling it had nothing to lose, took some huge political risks in embracing controversial policies on negative gearing and superannuation reform to the election. This was not enough to overcome the electorate's apparent resistance to tossing out a first-term government, wanting to see how Malcolm Turnbull would fare as Prime Minister, not wanting to return to Labor. But the election result was still extraordinary given the spectacle of spectacular disunity within the government, a lack of coherent policy direction, and perceptions of both weakness and indecision, and disappointment with Malcolm Turnbull from both the left and the right. And of course, this points to the big story of the 2016 election, the role of the minor parties and the drifting of the primary vote from the major parties, a story which has continued since the election. Let's unpack what the implications of that drift have been. In terms of the day-to-day management of the Senate, despite all the claims of disaster, I don't think it's actually had a demonstrably terrible effect. The particular minority party groupings of the current Senate have proved themselves politically pragmatic and professional at the business of politics. Unlike the last Senate, most of the crossbench senators are being well advised by experienced crossbench staff, and they're negotiating with a much more professional team of people in the coalition. The question that makes more of a public splash is the extent to which these parties are forcing the major parties to change their policy positions. It's certainly true that the presence of these minor parties, particularly One Nation, are unnerving many coalition MPs and in some cases even Labor MPs. But I would venture that despite all the noise, I don't think One Nation is so much pulling the coalition policy positions in one direction as giving permission to people to assert policy differences within the government. In much the same way, I think the Trump victory has given permission to a lot of voters in Australia to shift their votes away from establishment politics. There are clearly disturbing pressures coming from One Nation in its anti-Islamic rhetoric, but too often the party's influence is seen as being a purely right-wing one. The thing that makes current politics so complicated here and around the world are the cross-currents of what might once have been a clear right-left divide. Consider the protectionist agendas of both One Nation and the Nick Xenophon team. Yet One Nation is proving itself to have a very hardline policy position on the budget and welfare. Consider how the coalition, while advocating smaller government and lower taxes, commits itself to a $50 billion onshore submarine building program. Consider how Cory Bernardi, a true Conservative, is given relatively little prospect of major political success because his policies don't actually reflect the particular blend of populism at large in the world today. I think we are all struggling to find an appropriate framework for considering the realities of politics in 2017. That is, I think the conscious or even unconscious way we consider issues on a right-left Labor coalition divide doesn't really help us clearly see what's happening here or in the rest of the world. But I would venture that it is no longer worth just yearning for the good old days of consensus about free markets and smaller governments, just as it is no longer viable for governments to try to simply think they will get kudos for making general promises that they can cut $11 billion from the budget, or even that they can invoke debt crises to build a consensus for change. The answer to how you reformulate the political messages is proving elusive for savvier political heads than I. But as the federal Cabinet is currently constructing the May budget. That should be, though I'm not sure it is, their primary task. For let's face it, while the government is finally abandoning the fiction of many of the so-called zombie cuts from the disastrous 2014 budget, that only means it has to find a whole new series of cuts, generally all from the same portfolios, and find a way of selling them. This brings us to the vexed question of Malcolm Turnbull and what we should think of him, if we can't think of him in the ways we thought we could when he became Prime Minister. Maybe we should start with the way he thinks of himself. I've written in the past of how his office sees itself as the office of wicked problems. That reflects Turnbull's view of himself and his role as Prime Minister as primarily a problem solver. This reflects his long history in business, but it is a very different starting point from the traditional way most of our politicians might regard their daily job. It became clear during last year's election campaign that the Prime Minister was genuinely mystified by the widespread view that he had abandoned all his positions. He felt he had never changed his basic views, just pragmatically shifted with the facts. An emissions trading scheme, for example, might have been the right option in 2009 when the push was on for a global response. But both climate politics and technology have moved on since then, the argument goes. But particularly after the appalling decision to dump even considering an emissions intensity scheme at year's end, he just looks weak to most voters. The Prime Minister has also been trying to find a path back from the way politics has been conducted since 2009, particularly under the influence of Tony Abbott, a politics of ultra-partisanship and excessive claims all round. This is the problem where we are turning everything into an ideological battle, Turnbull told me at the end of last year. What does it mean when we talk about ideology? We are basically talking about being fact-free, frankly. It's not that Malcolm Turnbull doesn't think about politics, but it is not overtly a political focus. And being a problem solver, I think, means you have a different relationship to events than someone who might approach it as an opportunity to be exploited. I think it immediately makes you something of a hostage or maybe an observer to events rather than a shaper of them. You're a responder. In reality, much of what Prime Ministers do is respond. John Howard has famously said many times that it is how you deal with the problems thrust upon you in government rather than any electoral agenda that determines whether you are a good Prime Minister. And in Turnbull, we see a Prime Minister who events have conspired to have very little agenda of his own to start with. I'm not saying that none of that is his fault, but the reality is now that we well know that it is very difficult to rewrite a government's mandate when you change Prime Ministers mid-term. And despite the contempt for Turnbull's decisions not to proceed with major tax reform when he first became Prime Minister, there is not the money available to compensate people for reform that was there and greased the wheels of tax changes in the 1980s and particularly the 1990s. The Coalition had also locked itself into a completely balmy position on tax before the election when Scott Morrison took to the there is no revenue problem and low tax positions with such machismo. There was still plenty of scope for the Coalition to take a much more aggressive tax mix switching message to last year's election by addressing glaring problems like relative tax treatment of housing and superannuation, an approach that would have also helped address the inequality issues that help feed the One Nation-style discontent. Instead, it abandoned the mantle of tax bravery to Labor. The reason is that the Coalition has, it seems, as little faith in the capacity of its own base to look beyond its own self-interest, as the Coalition base apparently has in its parliamentary representatives. Tax has been such a powerful element of our political brawling for so long, we're having trouble finding new powerful ideas with which to encapsulate our political fights. Cabinet ministers wistfully acknowledge that the Prime Minister needs the one big idea to light up and define the government. You'll notice that I've talked a lot about Malcolm Turnbull and very little about the government as a whole. This, of course, is a reflection of the presidential political world we inhabit. The Prime Minister has been good to his word, on this issue at least. He's been determined to run a true cabinet government where ministers are left to run their own portfolios. This has led to its own disasters. The cabinet includes both some very promising young ministers and some real mediocrities, as most governments do. A less than ideal relationship between the Prime Minister and Treasurer is one of its biggest problems. And there is only a small coterie of ministers who seem to be able to see the collective interest in the government and work closely with the Prime Minister towards its re-election. Matthias Cormann, Peter Dutton, Michaelia Cash, Julie Bishop, Arthur Sinodinos and Simon Birmingham all come to mind. The forces that will force the government to really show its capacity this year are the circling pressure from ratings agencies for better budget outcomes. The need to show it is listening to those disengaged voters who believe they are not in the government's focus, and of course an increasingly exciting international outlook. We will just have to try to decipher how it is faring in facing these central questions amid the noise of the daily soap opera. Thank you.